the morning of February 13th, 2026, in North Ryde. Sydney began like any other 485-year-old Chris Baghsarian, a quiet, gentle man who had spent his life devoted to family and simple routines. For years, Chris had lived alone since the passing of his wife, surrounded by memories of a past filled with love, laughter, and the steady rhythms of ordinary life. The suburb itself was peaceful, lined with leafy streets, modest homes, and the occasional barking dog echoing in the distance. It was a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where the familiar faces of neighbors crossing the street with morning coffee were comforting rather than alarming. Chris' mornings typically started early. He would sit on his front porch, sipping tea, listening to birdsong, and checking on his small garden. The day of February 13th was no exception. The stillness was violently broken. Chris was startled awake by loud bangs at his front door. Before he could process what was happening, strangers had forced their way inside. Witnesses later described seeing a car speeding away from his house within minutes, a gray vehicle that would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. Chris was seized, restrained, and thrown into the back of the car. Panic, confusion, and disbelief consumed him in those terrifying moments. From the outside, the quiet suburban mornings seemed unchanged. Yet inside Chris' home, a nightmare was unfolding that would shock the community and the nation. By mid-morning, neighbors, aware of the unusual commotion, called the police. It was the first of several rapid alerts that set law enforcement into motion. The response was immediate, with local patrol units and emergency dispatchers coordinating with higher authorities. Initially, officers treated it as a possible missing person case, but early clues quickly suggested something far more sinister. Broken glass, signs of forced entry, and witness accounts painted a picture of abduction, not just a temporary disappearance. News of the incident began to spread through the neighborhood, and by the afternoon, local media outlets reported on the shocking kidnapping of an elderly man with no known enemies. The urgency intensified when police traced a suspicious vehicle seen near the residence on the morning of the abduction. The gray car was later discovered partially burned, a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence. Forensic teams scoured the area, collecting what fragments they could recover. Investigators quickly realized that this case involved more than a random act of violence. It suggested coordination, planning, and potentially ties to organized crime. Chris, a man who had lived an ordinary life, had inadvertently become the target of a complex criminal operation. By evening, the scale of the police response had grown. Tactical units, helicopters, and drones combed the surrounding areas, while detectives meticulously examined the evidence, following every lead that could shed light on Chris' whereabouts. Family members were left waiting anxiously, unable to comprehend how such a peaceful life could be abruptly shattered by violence. News crews arrived, capturing footage of law enforcement activity and speaking with neighbors, who described Chris as a kind, elderly man who had done nothing to deserve such horror. Throughout the night, authorities continued their search, piecing together clues from vehicle traces, digital evidence, and witness statements. The prevailing theory began to emerge. Chris may have been taken by mistake. The intended target was reportedly someone else entirely, potentially involved in criminal activity, and Chris had tragically been caught in the crossfire. This chilling realization added a layer of tragedy and disbelief for his family and the public. What had begun as a serene morning in Sydney had turned into a tense and heart-wrenching search, marking the beginning of a story that would grip the nation and unfold with shocking revelations in the days to come. As the sun rose over Sydney on February 14th, 2026, the city awoke to a grim reality. The search for Chris Baghsarian had intensified, and law enforcement was now operating at full capacity. The New South Wales Police, particularly the Robbery and Serious Crime Squad, had taken charge, coordinating search operations and compiling every shred of evidence. Chris, an 85-year-old widower with no known enemies, had been thrust into the center of a criminal plot far beyond his ordinary life. Investigators were working tirelessly to unravel the events that had led to his sudden and shocking abduction from his quiet North Ryde home. Initial forensic examination focused on the gray vehicle seen, fleeing the Baghsarian residence the morning of the kidnapping. The car, later discovered partially burned in a bushland area, provided essential clues. Investigators retrieved fragments of forensic evidence, fibers, fingerprints, and traces of accelerant used in the arson attempt. Each piece offered a small, yet significant, window into the criminal's movements and planning. The vehicle's path was traced using traffic cameras and witnesses' accounts, allowing authorities to construct a preliminary timeline of the abduction. But beyond physical evidence, the human element, the potential motives, suspects, and the psychology of the kidnappers remained a challenging puzzle. Early on, detectives began to uncover a shocking possibility. Chris may not have been the intended target. Evidence suggested that the criminals had been seeking someone else entirely, an individual living in the same neighborhood with connections to organized crime. Chris, living a peaceful, law-abiding life, had tragically become a victim of mistaken identity. This revelation added an extra layer of urgency and heartbreak. The police realized that any further delay could place Chris at extreme risk. In press briefings, senior officers acknowledged the mistaken identity theory, urging the perpetrators to release him unharmed, and warning the public that the crime was not random. Meanwhile, the scale of the investigation expanded. Tactical units combed the surrounding suburbs, focusing on areas where sightings of the gray vehicle had been reported. Drone surveillance scanned bushland for traces of a makeshift holding site. Detectives cross-referenced phone records, social media activity, and CCTV footage to establish patterns of movement for both Chris and potential suspects. Every lead was followed, no matter how small, in hopes of locating him before the situation escalated further. As hours passed, the pressure mounted. Chris' family, devastated and desperate, provided additional insights into his routines, habits, and potential vulnerabilities. Neighbors were interviewed, asked to report any suspicious activity, and encouraged to remain vigilant. Public appeals for information were broadcast, capturing the attention of Sydney residents who were shocked that such violence could penetrate their quiet, residential community. The media coverage was extensive, highlighting the abduction's unusual circumstances, the advanced age of the victim, the possible mistaken identity, and the calculated measures the criminals had taken to avoid detection. Police also began to explore the possibility that Chris had been moved to a rural location outside Sydney. The abandoned, burnt-out vehicles suggested that the criminals had sought to eliminate evidence and mislead investigators. The focus shifted to properties on the outskirts of the city, particularly in bushland areas and rural fringes. Search teams scoured every potential hideout, analyzing footprints, tire tracks, and other physical evidence. The investigation demanded precision and coordination, with detectives piecing together fragmented clues in a race against time. Throughout this phase, the theory of mistaken identity remained central to the police strategy. Officers understood that the longer Chris remained in captivity, the more dangerous the situation could become. Every decision, from search patterns to forensic analysis, was informed by the urgent need to protect an innocent man who had been caught in the crossfire of a sophisticated criminal operation. The investigation was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a complex, high-stakes effort to save a life and bring the perpetrators to justice. By February 15, 2026, the abduction of Chris Baghsarian had captured the attention of all of Sydney. The city, usually accustomed to its quiet routines, was now tense as news outlets, social media, and local communities amplified the story of the 80s grandfather who had been forcibly taken from his home. Police had intensified the search, deploying every available resource to locate him. Tactical units moved into rural and semi-rural areas on the outskirts of North Ryde, while air surveillance through helicopters and drones scanned bushland, open fields, and dense forested areas where the kidnappers might have hidden Chris. The investigation was evolving rapidly, with each piece of information scrutinized for clues. Police emphasized that Chris' kidnapping was not a random act, but appeared to be connected to a more sophisticated criminal scheme. Analysis of the abandoned, partially burnt gray vehicle revealed that it had been deliberately destroyed to erase evidence, signaling that the kidnappers were experienced and calculated. Detectives worked around the clock, examining tire tracks, footprints, and forensic traces left in the surrounding areas. Each piece of evidence, though small, could potentially lead to the location where Chris was being held. The sheer scale of the operation suggested that the perpetrators were organized, careful, and willing to go to extreme lengths to evade capture. The community's response was immediate and emotional. Neighbors, friends, and local residents rallied to support Chris' family, leaving messages of hope, signs of encouragement, and offering whatever assistance they could provide. Social media feeds were filled with images of the quiet, gentle man, and appeals to anyone with information to contact authorities. The story became a talking point across Sydney, with citizens grappling with disbelief that such violence could touch their peaceful neighborhood. Public sentiment was a mix of empathy, outrage, and fear. Many questioned how an innocent elderly man could have been caught in a criminal conspiracy that did not concern him. While community support poured in, the police maintained a strict operational approach. Every tip, no matter how minor, was logged and investigated. Investigators worked tirelessly to connect sightings, vehicle movements, and digital evidence to construct a timeline of events following the kidnapping. The focus remained on locating Chris safely, understanding that any lapse in judgment could have catastrophic consequences. The notion that Chris was a victim of mistaken identity heightened the urgency, as authorities knew that the kidnapper's original plan had been disrupted by unforeseen circumstances. The wrong person had been taken, and with time against them, the situation was increasingly perilous. Throughout the day, law enforcement briefings communicated that the search was entering a critical phase. Durrell, Glenary, and surrounding rural areas became the central focus of the operation. Investigators canvassed properties, bushland, and remote tracks, using trained search teams, sniffer dogs, and aerial reconnaissance. Volunteers from the community, coordinated under police supervision, assisted in mapping the search areas, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. The urgency was palpable. Every hour that passed without a confirmed sighting of Chris increased anxiety, both among his family and the wider public. The media coverage amplified the story's impact, portraying Chris not merely as a missing man but as a symbol of vulnerability and injustice. News outlets highlighted the idea of mistaken identity, the audacity of the criminals, and the complexity of the investigation. Viewers and readers were captivated and horrified, as the narrative underscored the fragility of safety and the terrifying reach of organized criminal activity. Experts in law enforcement were invited on television and radio programs to analyze the case, speculate on motives, and provide insight into how such sophisticated kidnappings occurred in modern suburban communities. By nightfall, despite the exhaustive efforts, Chris had not yet been found. The community's anxiety remained high, with many families in the area checking on elderly relatives and neighbors. Police continued their meticulous and relentless search, emphasizing both the danger and the hope inherent in such operations. The narrative of a peaceful grandfather caught in the wrong place at the wrong time gripped Sydney, leaving an indelible mark on the city's collective consciousness. The days ahead promised to reveal more about both the criminals' intentions and the resilience of those committed to bringing Chris home safely. By February 16, 2026, the search for Chris Baghsarian had reached a critical stage. Police operations had intensified across the rural fringes of Sydney, focusing on locations identified through forensic analysis and witness accounts. The partially burned gray vehicle, recovered near Glenary, had provided investigators with valuable clues. T-ray patterns, fragments of materials, and traces of accelerants that hinted at the kidnapper's movements. Detectives meticulously traced every lead, cross-referencing traffic cameras, mobile phone data, and the movements of individuals known to be connected to organized criminal activity. Time was of the essence, as authorities were acutely aware that the elderly man's life was hanging in the balance. The police theory of mistaken identity had guided much of the investigation. Early indications suggested that the intended target was someone else entirely, possibly a person with known affiliations to criminal networks in Sydney. Chris, an 85-year-old man, living a quiet life, had tragically become the unintended victim of this calculated plot. Investigators understood the psychological and operational complexity of the situation. Criminals experienced in organized operations rarely left mistakes uncorrected, which meant that Chris' situation could be precarious. Every decision, from search deployment to interrogation of suspects, was conducted with precision, balancing the urgency of rescue with the need for meticulous evidence collection. It was in the early hours of the morning that breakthrough intelligence began to emerge. Police had been monitoring known associates of the suspected kidnappers and identified suspicious communications pointing toward a remote property in the Durrell area. Surveillance teams quickly moved into position, establishing perimeter control and observing movements from a distance. The surrounding area, dense with bushland and uneven terrain, was difficult to navigate, but officers remained determined. The tension was palpable. The investigators knew that confronting the kidnappers directly could provoke dangerous outcomes, yet the imperative to find Chris alive was paramount. As daylight broke, officers moved carefully toward the property. Every detail was scrutinized: windows, entry points, and any signs of recent human activity. Canine units were employed to detect scents and track potential pathways the kidnappers may have used. Helicopters hovered above, providing aerial reconnaissance and relaying real-time imagery to the command center. Families of the victims were briefed intermittently, their hope and anxiety interwoven as police worked tirelessly to locate Chris. The narrative of mistaken identity, initially regarded as a chilling theory, had transformed into a concrete understanding of the risks facing him and the need for rapid intervention. The confrontation itself was swift. Police, coordinated with tactical precision, approached the suspect's location under cover of aerial observation. Moments later, 2 individuals were apprehended. Both were linked to prior criminal activity and had direct involvement in Chris' abduction. Evidence recovered on site, including restraints, personal belongings, and traces of Chris' presence, confirmed the identity of the kidnapped man. The suspects were arrested without incident, though the gravity of the crime weighed heavily on all involved. Chris' well-being was the immediate priority, and paramedics and officers carefully assessed his physical and emotional condition. The elderly man, though shaken and disoriented, had survived the ordeal, a relief that brought temporary solace to a family who had feared the worst. Following the arrests, police began the process of reconstructing the events in detail. Interrogations of the suspects revealed their motives: a ransom demand, a misidentified target, and a premeditated plan that had been tragically misdirected. The revelation of the mistaken identity theory confirmed that Chris had been an unintended victim, his peaceful life disrupted by forces entirely beyond his control. Investigators documented each aspect meticulously, preparing the case for prosecution and ensuring that justice would be pursued fully. By evening, Chris was reunited with his family, the initial shock gradually giving way to relief, gratitude, and lingering trauma. The community, which had followed the investigation closely, breathed a collective sigh of relief, though awareness of the dangers posed by organized criminal activity remained heightened. The confrontation had resolved the immediate threat, but the psychological and social impact of the kidnapping would linger, a sobering reminder of how quickly ordinary life could be upended by violence and error. In the days following the rescue of Chris Baghsarian, the city of Sydney grappled with the profound impact of the crime. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting the harrowing ordeal of an 85-year-old man who had been abducted in a case of mistaken identity. Public interest remained intense, not just because of the shocking nature of the abduction, but because it revealed vulnerabilities in the safety of ordinary citizens and exposed the reach of organized criminal networks operating within suburban areas. For Chris and his family, the aftermath was a complex mix of relief, trauma, and the slow process of rebuilding a sense of normalcy. Authorities worked meticulously to ensure that justice would be served. The 2 individuals apprehended during the confrontation were formally charged with kidnapping, assault, and related offenses, including premeditated abduction. Their connection to organized criminal groups was established through ongoing investigations, digital evidence, and prior criminal records. Police emphasized that the crime was sophisticated and highly planned, highlighting the danger posed by professional criminal activity and the meticulous nature of their operations. Despite their detailed planning, the criminals' failure to correctly identify their target had inadvertently led to the exposure and eventual capture of the perpetrators. The legal proceedings that followed were closely monitored. Prosecutors compiled extensive evidence, including forensic data from the crime scene, witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and the confessions obtained during police interrogations. Each piece of evidence demonstrated the careful orchestration behind the abduction and the deliberate efforts to cover the criminal's tracks. The defense, meanwhile, sought to challenge elements of the evidence, but the overwhelming weight of proof supported the prosecution's case. The trial, though emotionally taxing for Chris and his family, offered a structured process through which accountability could be pursued. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on Chris became a significant focus. Though physically unharmed, he experienced the lingering effects of fear, anxiety, and trauma in victims of violent crime. Support services, including counseling and therapy, were arranged to assist him and his family in navigating the emotional aftermath. Friends, neighbors, and community groups rallied to provide assistance, offering both practical help and emotional support. The case became a reminder of the critical importance of community solidarity in the wake of violent events and the role of social support networks in recovery. For the public, Chris' story became emblematic of both vulnerability and resilience. Media coverage emphasized the human element, an ordinary elderly man, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, surviving against the odds. Discussions in public forums and social media often centered on lessons from the event. The necessity for vigilance, the importance of swift law enforcement response, and the need for legal frameworks capable of addressing sophisticated criminal activity. The case spurred conversations about neighborhood safety, the risks of mistaken identity in criminal activity, and broader societal issues relating to crime prevention and justice. Reflecting on the events, law enforcement officials highlighted the importance of coordinated efforts, rapid response, and community involvement in ensuring Chris' rescue. Every step of the investigation, from the initial call to the tactical confrontation and eventual arrests, demonstrated the critical interplay between police diligence and public cooperation. For Chris, the ordeal reshaped his perspective on security, trust, and the unpredictability of life. Yet it also reinforced his gratitude for the dedication of the officers who had risked themselves to save him. In the end, the case of Chris Baghsarian left an enduring impact on Sydney. The criminals were brought to justice, ensuring accountability for their actions, while the community found ways to process the event and reinforce safety measures. Chris' survival and the successful resolution of the case served as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience, illustrating how ordinary lives can be disrupted by extraordinary events, and how courage, persistence, and community solidarity can ultimately restore hope and justice.